The station was dusted in gold, as if the sun itself had paused to mourn for her. Eliza May stepped down from the train with her head lowered, her gloved fingers curled tightly around the handle of a battered leather case. Her bonnet, modest and slate blue, shadowed her face from the gathering glances. The dust beneath her boots was warm, but the air around her felt cold, carved hollow by a silence too loud to ignore. She didn't speak. She hadn't, not in the letters she sent, nor in the handful of words exchanged with the matchmaker. But she could read and she could write, and her penmanship was careful, elegant. She'd written truth. She was obedient, gentle, good with animals, patient with children. She'd written she had no family left and would serve her husband faithfully if he'd let her stay. She never wrote that she was quiet by force of habit. Quiet by survival. Silence had been her shelter once, when a slap followed every question, when her mother's voice was buried beneath bruises, when her own words were called curses. She waited on the platform. The townsfolk gathered, some under the pretense of errands, others openly gawking. Mail-order brides were a spectacle in these parts. Some came bold, painted, loud with hope. Some came with babies clutched to their hips and lies stitched into their sleeves. Eliza came alone. Plain. Tall. Pretty in the way a still lake might be, reflective, hard to touch. And then he came stomping up, Harlan Sykes. Large man. Loud voice. Spit already wetting the edge of his tobacco-darkened grin. He paused a few feet from her, looked her up and down like he was checking for dents in a wagon. "That her?" he asked the station master, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's the one, Mr. Sykes." Eliza lifted her chin, offered a nod. Not a word. Harlan squinted. "What's the matter with her? Cat got her tongue?" No answer. She held out a folded letter, the one he'd sent her, full of promises, of barns to build and bread to bake. He didn't take it. "Ain't gonna be no good to me if she don't talk. I asked for a wife, not a church mouse." His voice had a laugh wound inside it, but his eyes were mean. "You mute or just dumb?" Still no sound. Only her eyes. Wide steady. Not broken, yet. Someone snickered. A girl in a red shawl whispered to another woman. Someone else muttered, "Poor thing probably don't even know how to cook." The wind blew soft over the crowd. It caught Eliza's skirt and lifted the hem just slightly. She reached to smooth it down, her hands trembling now, ever so slightly. Harlan watched that tremble and grinned. "Go on," he called to the onlookers. "Ain't nobody marrying no ghost." With that, he turned and walked away, spurs jangling like punctuation on the insult. The crowd didn't part for her. They watched her like she was a strange creature let loose from a cage. Eliza didn't cry. Her throat burned, but her face stayed dry. She walked, slowly at first, then faster, down the station steps, past the horses, past the man with sacks of flour, past the group of women who stared but didn't speak. She passed the saloon with its open doors and piano music playing a cheerful lie. She walked until she didn't know where the dirt ended and the prairie began. No one stopped her. She was the quiet girl after all. But someone had seen her. From the far side of the corral, a man watched, tall, broad-shouldered, with a faded coat and a brimmed hat that shadowed much of his face. He leaned against the post fence, arms crossed. The others hadn't noticed him, but he'd been there all along. He held a wildflower in his hand, delicate and violet blue, pressed gently between two calloused fingers. When Eliza passed by the fence line, he did not call to her. He didn't ask questions. He only watched. That night the rain came hard. Thunder rolled like angry drums across the plains, and the streets filled with puddles too wide to step over. Eliza sat beneath the overhang of a shuttered general store, her shawl soaked through, her suitcase useless now, stuffed with letters no one wanted to read again. She pulled her knees to her chest and lowered her head. The silence around her was no longer hers. It was cruel now, bitter and sharp. It pressed in from all sides, and it hurt more than she could ever say. The sound of boots came next. Not many. Just one pair. They stopped inches from her feet. She looked up slowly, blinking past the water in her lashes. The man stood in the rain without flinching. His coat was worn. His beard trimmed but rough. His eyes were kind. He knelt slowly, careful not to frighten her. He didn't speak. He reached into his coat and pulled out a dry piece of cloth and a small metal cup. He poured from a flask she hadn't seen. Then he placed the cup beside her and sat down, letting the rain soak through his hat and into his hair. His gaze didn't prod or pity. He simply waited. Eliza looked at the cup, then at him. She didn't ask why. She just picked it up with cold fingers and drank. Still not a word between them. But something passed through the air that night, a message with no letters, no sound. Just two souls sitting in a silence that felt less lonely when shared. And far off, behind the clouds, the lightning softened. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke and something faintly sweet, apples left drying on a tin plate near the stove. Eliza woke with the softness of wool beneath her and the warmth of a thick quilt tucked gently around her frame. Her boots were off, her dress dry. A low fire crackled in the hearth. Shadows danced on the log walls, long and slow. For a moment she thought it was a dream. But then her eyes caught the cup from last night, now empty on a small table. A note rested beside it, written in neat, block letters. "You're safe. I'll be back before sun's high. E.B." She sat up slowly, the pain in her back reminding her of the cold ground she'd curled on hours before. Her fingers ran over the stitching of the quilt. Worn but careful. Repaired many times, like someone had refused to throw away even the broken parts. She rose, legs unsteady but working, and stepped to the door. Through the window she saw him. He was in the field behind the barn, swinging an axe with smooth, practiced strokes. Snow lined the fence posts, melting under the new sun. Each motion of his arms sent chips of wood flying. He worked in silence. There was something graceful about the way he moved, like the earth had taught him rhythm in place of sound. She watched for a while before stepping out. The air bit gently at her cheeks, but the sun kept it from turning cruel. When she crossed the porch, he noticed her. His eyes met hers. No surprise. No urgency. Just quiet acknowledgement. He placed the axe down gently and walked toward her, stopping a few paces away. Then, with slow hands, he pointed to his chest. "Elias." She watched, then nodded and touched her own. "Eliza." He smiled with his eyes, not his mouth. Then he pointed toward the house, gave a thumbs up, and raised an eyebrow. "All right?" She nodded again. It became the first of many such mornings. They spoke without speaking. Elias would leave instructions by gesture or written word. She followed, sometimes fumbling, sometimes surprising herself. He'd show her the way to feed the hens, how to draw water from the well without freezing her hands, how to recognize when the mule was pretending to limp just to avoid work. In return, she cleaned the kitchen until it glowed. She mended the tear in his only winter coat. She baked bread with a nervous hand, waiting for a grimace that never came. Instead, he tapped his chest once, then nodded, holding the warm slice like it meant something. The silence between them was not empty. It brimmed with small things. Glances. The way he offered her a mug before pouring his own. The way she paused to dust the corner of a windowsill he hadn't noticed. Shared, wordless kindness. But outside their quiet world, judgment stirred. When Elias took her into town for the first time, just to restock salt, sugar, and coffee, the stares returned like wolves sniffing old scent. "She stays with him now?" whispered a woman with a fur collar and a pinched mouth. "Two of 'em don't say a word between 'em. Maybe they like it that way," muttered the butcher to a customer too eager to laugh. Harlan Sykes leaned against the railing of the mercantile, chewing tobacco and watching her with that same calculating look from before. Guess even the deaf need someone to keep their bed warm. Elias didn't hear it. But Eliza did. And this time her silence didn't feel like surrender, it felt like stone. Later that day, she found a piece of paper folded on the table when she returned from splitting kindling. Elias had written, "They talk because they don't listen. Don't let them steal your peace." She held the note for a long while before folding it again and slipping it into her apron pocket. That night, he fixed the broken hinge on the barn door while she boiled water for stew. When he entered, snow clinging to his coat, she surprised him by handing him a folded page. Her handwriting curved in soft, deliberate lines. "Why did you help me?" He read it carefully, then looked at her, eyes still. He reached for a coal pencil and wrote beneath her question. "Because I saw myself in you." He didn't elaborate. And he didn't have to. Later, she would come to learn the truth in fragments. His mother had died in childbirth. His father, a brute, had beaten the hearing out of him when he was just a boy. He'd been cast aside by townsfolk, expected to live as less than a man. But Elias had built this ranch with his own two hands. No one had given him anything. And still he found room to share it. One evening, as she brought in firewood, the wind howled sudden and sharp, the storm rolling in. She fumbled to latch the door shut. Elias reached past her to help, his hand brushing hers. They froze. His eyes searched hers, gentle but asking. She didn't pull away. But she didn't lean in. Not yet. Instead, she held his gaze and nodded, just once. Trust. It had taken root. And though neither of them spoke aloud, the cabin felt full that night, full of something warmer than fire and deeper than words. Outside, snow began to fall. Inside, two quiet souls sat across from one another, joined not by noise, but by a silence that finally felt like home. The prairie was beginning to thaw. Morning frost melted into soft mud, and small green shoots pushed bravely through the soil beside the fence posts. In the week since Eliza arrived at Elias's ranch, the land had begun to shift, and so had she. Every day followed a rhythm, quiet and deliberate. They worked side by side, she with a wash basin or a broom, he with hammer and rope. When their hands met in passing, brushing against the same pail, the same worn saddle strap, neither flinched any more. There were no declarations, no awkward questions. Only the kind of closeness that grows slowly like ivy winding over a cabin wall. It didn't need sunlight to bloom. Just time. Just touch. Just the quiet between them. One evening she found herself humming by the stove, an old tune from her childhood, something her mother used to murmur while shelling peas. She hadn't realized she was doing it until she turned and saw Elias watching her. Not confused. Not surprised. Moved. He stepped closer, hesitating only a moment before reaching out, his hand light against her throat, feeling the hum. His gaze never left her face. Then he touched his own chest and offered a single nod. She understood. She didn't need to speak for him to hear her. That night the two of them sat on the porch, sharing the last of the coffee. No words. Just stars above them and the creak of the old rocking chair between them. It might have been enough to let that be the shape of things. Safe. Silent. Sure. But the world beyond the ranch hadn't forgotten her, and it hadn't forgiven Elias. When the supplies dwindled, they rode into town again. The mood had shifted. The stares were sharper now, the whispers louder. She walked a little closer to Elias this time, her chin lifted, her spine straight. Inside the mercantile, the shopkeeper didn't meet her eyes. He handed Elias a sack of flour and said, "Didn't expect you to come in today." Elias raised a brow, confused. Another man in the store muttered under his breath, "He keeps bringing that girl back." Thought he'd have learned by now. They walked out without comment. But near the hitching post, Harlan Sykes was waiting. Leaning against the saloon rail, boots crossed, hat tilted back just enough to show the grin that made Eliza's stomach twist. Well, Harlan called. "If it ain't the silent pair. Tell me, Elias, what's it like waking up to a woman who don't even know how to scream?" Elias didn't react. Harlan stepped forward, chewing the last of his words. "Maybe she ain't got nothing worth saying." Eliza stood frozen. Heat crawled up her neck, but she kept her head high. Harlan moved closer. "She with you by choice?" he sneered. "Or just too scared to run?" Before Elias could step in, Eliza did something no one expected. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and held it out to Harlan with steady hands. He laughed. "What's this?" "A love note." He opened it. The handwriting was small, precise. "I'd rather be quiet with a good man than speak 1,000 words to a coward." The smile dropped off his face. Elias stepped forward then, not in violence but in defense, a solid wall between her and the man who'd made her suffer. Harlan spat on the dirt and backed away. "Keep her. She's yours to deal with." They rode home in silence. Not from fear. Not from sadness. But from pride. Eliza's quiet had changed. It was no longer the sound of retreat. It had become the sound of choice. That evening, Elias brought out a saddle he'd been repairing for weeks. It had delicate tooling along the edges, birds in flight, wildflowers blooming along the leather. He handed it to her without a note. She ran her fingers over the craftsmanship, then looked up. He tapped his chest. A gift. She blinked back something warm and deep in her throat. In return she reached for his hand. They didn't kiss. They didn't speak. But her touch lingered longer than it ever had. Later that night the winds began to howl. A storm rolled over the hills, dark and fast. Elias went out to secure the barn. Eliza lit a lantern and stood at the door, waiting for his return. But something felt wrong. Far in the distance shapes moved on horseback. Not the neighbor's boys. Not ranch hands. 3 riders. Fast. Unfriendly. She ran out, bare feet hitting the cold boards of the porch. She waved her lantern once. Elias turned toward her from the barn door. His face stiffened. He saw them too. They met halfway between the barn and the house, eyes locked. Eliza handed him the lantern, then pointed toward the ridge. He nodded. Danger was coming. He signed 2 words with quick, urgent gestures. Inside. Hide. But she shook her head. He tried again. She shook her head harder. And then she turned, ran back into the house, and returned moments later with the old rifle he'd shown her how to use just weeks ago. She held it steady. No tremble in her hands. He looked at her with something fierce and unspoken. Respect. The thunder cracked once, loud enough to silence even the wind, and the hooves grew closer. The storm hit as the riders crested the ridge, their silhouettes jagged and dark against the flickering sky. Rain hadn't come yet, but the clouds churned like bruises above the prairie. Eliza stood on the porch, rifle cradled in her arms, her breath calm but deliberate. Her dress clung slightly from the rising wind, and her hair, once so carefully pinned, had begun to loosen strand by strand. Elias stood beside her now. He didn't try to take the rifle from her. He didn't motion for her to step back. He simply planted his boots in the dirt and loaded his own weapon. The way he looked at her then, there was no fear in it. No pity. Only belief. The horses slowed as they drew near, lantern light casting sharp angles over the men's faces. Harlan Sykes rode in front, reins loose in one hand, a bottle in the other. Behind him were two strangers with scarred faces and worn coats. Guns hung easy at their hips, like they'd been used more than once without hesitation. Harlan didn't wait to speak. He raised his voice above the wind, slurring slightly. "Evenin', Elias. Thought maybe you'd like some company tonight. Heard you've been playin' house with a girl who don't speak. Figured I'd bring her a real conversation." Elias said nothing. He simply raised his rifle slightly, not aiming, just promising. Eliza stepped forward. Harlan grinned, but it faltered when she didn't flinch. She stopped just off the porch steps, her figure outlined in golden light from the cabin behind her. "This is your last warning," she said, voice low but unmistakably clear. It was the first time anyone in town had heard her speak. The men blinked. Harlan leaned forward in the saddle, squinting as if unsure if the words were real. "Well, look at that," he muttered, smile trying to return. "So she can talk. Just needed the right kind of encouragement." Eliza didn't move. "I said," she repeated, "this is your last warning. You come further, you don't leave the same." One of Harlan's men reached for his holster. The rifle cracked before anyone else moved. A bullet struck the dirt inches from his boot. He stopped. Rain began to fall, soft and steady. Not enough to break the tension, only enough to mark the moment with cold clarity. The scent of damp earth filled the space between the cabin and the riders, and thunder rumbled behind it. Harlan's hand twitched. Elias cocked his weapon with one motion. The second man raised both hands slightly, eyes darting. "Harlan, maybe we ride back. This ain't worth it." Harlan stared at Eliza, hatred in the shape of confusion in his eyes. He couldn't understand how the woman he'd ridiculed now stood firm, unshaking, between him and whatever vengeance he thought he deserved. He spat onto the ground, then pulled his horse back slowly. "You're not worth the trouble," he said, turning. "You're both already broken. Let the wind finish the job." They left without another word. Only the sound of hooves fading into the storm. Elias exhaled. His hands lowered. Eliza stood still for a moment longer, then let the rifle rest against her thigh. She was shaking now, but not from fear. Her body had simply remembered what it meant to fight for itself. To hold ground no one thought she could. He reached for her, just one hand, palm open as if asking. She stepped into it, leaned against his chest. And for a long time they stood that way, letting the rain cover them in silence that didn't hurt anymore. The next morning brought sun that warmed the fields and dried the porch steps. The town buzzed with whispers once again, but different now. No one mocked Elias Boone. And no one laughed when they saw Eliza beside him. Some nodded. Others looked away, ashamed. A week later, Elias carved a new sign for the front gate. 2 names. No title. No claim. Just truth. And one evening, after she'd finished kneading bread and he'd fixed a broken hinge on the henhouse, they sat together under the stars again. She reached for his hand this time. He turned to her slowly. "I found my voice," she said, barely louder than the wind. "But I think I love you most because you never needed it." He smiled. Small. Then he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed it there, once, firm as if sealing a promise. Their quiet had roared once. It didn't need to again. But the world would remember it all the same.